Good morning. So thank you for sticking with us. And again, I think we're going to have another wonderful treat here this morning, a chance to talk to one of the real leaders and drivers in healthcare. Our guest this morning is Vasant Narasimhan, and he is the CEO of Novartis as of 1 February 2018. And this is really a welcome back to Boston for Vas. So welcome back to Boston. He joined Novartis in 2005. He's held numerous leadership positions. He's been the head of global drug development. He also had a role in vaccine development and has been part of the biosimilars pipeline at the company as well. He's also held commercial and strategic roles at Novartis. He was region head Novartis Vaccines North America and U.S. country president of Novartis Vaccines and Diagnostics. Before joining Novartis, Dr. Narasimhan worked at McKinsey and prior to that worked at the World Health Organization. He received his medical degree right here from Harvard Medical School and obtained a master's degree at the Harvard Kennedy School. He received his bachelor's degree in biological sciences from the University of Chicago, and he is a member of the National Academy of Medicine. So welcome, Dr. Narasimhan. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. One of the, I think, things that you bring to this role, Vas, is that unlike a lot of the other CEOs that we talk to in the pharma world, you're a physician. You come from that background, and you're as much in that world as you are in the business community. How does that inform the perspective that you bring to your work at Novartis?
Yeah, you know, it's exciting to have such the opportunity to shape medicine and hopefully bring new medicines to patients around the world. I try to take a very patient-centered view, a humanistic view for the role our company plays, both in terms of the role we play in advancing care, but also our role in the broader public health dialogue and how we have to be, I think, part of the solution. Because in my mind, I do this role more for the impact we have on society, the impact we have on patients, much more than, and believing that if we do that well, we'll be able to deliver the financial returns and the results. The other element is I come from a R&D background. And so I'm deeply rooted in the innovation that we have to deliver. I've overseen our clinical trials efforts around the world for many years. And I understand that that innovation engine really is rooted in working with the medical community, working with scientists and physicians like the people in this room. And in order for us to succeed, we're going to have to do that well. And we have to keep innovating and really pushing the boundaries of where we can create, transformational efficacy for patients.
Yeah, when we talked several weeks ago, you said something I think that was it was really incredibly exciting. And you said that, you see Novartis' future as a medicines and data sciences company, a medicine and data sciences company. Can you expand a little bit about that and what that transition means for you and for the company?
When I started to reflect on what is the future of our industry, a future of a company like ours, it began to dawn on me, we're entering this new age. It's the reason why all of you are in this room today, to think about how data is going to transform everything around us in our lives, as it already has in many, many industries. And I saw a few big changes that were going to happen. One, I believe that data science and artificial intelligence will fundamentally make companies like us much more efficient. So how do we run clinical trials and how do we find patients for our clinical trials? If you think about it, we're a company that makes 50 to 70 billion doses of medicine every year. How is that whole manufacturing operation going to become much more efficient? We have an organization of 120,000 people every day interacting with the physician community and scientists. How do we make that more efficient? So I think that was one level I saw data science, just helping us become a much more efficient operation. But then the next level, when you look at it, is how can we mine our data to actually get new insights, both about the drugs we develop as well as the patients that we reach. And we've already seen the evidence of that. So we've just launched something we call the Study Operations Center, which was born out of studying Boeing and other aerospace, the aerospace industry, looking at how you can use artificial intelligence to run your clinical trial architecture around the world. So we run 500 clinical trials every year. We interact with tens of thousands of investigators in over 50 countries. We've now created a study operations center where we can see what's going on in every one of those study sites around the world in real time. And we have predictive algorithms telling us how the enrollment's going, how the quality is going, how is the cost going. And then those teams can then adjust how those sites are going to operate and what we might do to change how these trials are being run. Another example is when you look at the amount of data we have as a company. I mean, running 500 trials a year, we have these vast stores of clinical trial data and research data, which have never been mined. I mean, you've heard about it, I'm sure, on stage, all of the imaging data and biomarker data. And if you can start to mine that data, you might find new drug insights. One example we have is if you look at Entresto, our cardiovascular or congestive heart failure medicine, when we mine the data set of those 5,000 plus or 10,000 patients in that study, what we learned was there were different phenotypes of patients which you could figure out, understand using proteomic analysis combined with genetics and biomarkers, and find new signatures which we could then use for drug discovery. So to really link the clinic and the clinical experience back to the bench. So I think those are really exciting things now that can really transform a company like ours. The question I ask myself, and certainly meeting companies like NVIDIA these last couple of days, is how will our entire business model change in the future? Could you imagine a world where we end up finding a drug target in our labs, and then all of the work to identify the molecule that's going to fit that keyhole, the key to really unlock the biology in a patient, could be done by artificial intelligence? Could quantum computing ultimately allow us to design the drug completely through artificial intelligence? And all our work comes down to finding the target, and the whole drug process then after that, through real-world evidence and blockchain, could the whole R&D process be blown up? That's a reality we're going to have to be prepared for. And so that's why I think we have to pivot to become a data science company.
Yeah, I think that just the whole notion of a command or a mission control for all your trials that are going on and being able to harness all the clinical trials data that you've collected in the past are terrific. One of the things that we heard yesterday was that what we're talking about here is we're talking about the Jetsons, but the reality is that we're living in the world of the Flintstones. Yeah. And when we think about that, has the pharma industry been slow in embracing digital technology? What have been the barriers? How is that changing?
Yeah, I always tell my teams we have to win the race of the turtles, because and that's really the goal at the moment. I mean, we as an industry have not evolved. I think if you look at most industries today, they're much more advanced than the pharmaceutical industry, and of course in healthcare in general, in adopting these advanced technologies to transform how they work. I mean, if you go to insurance and banking, their ability to transact data and use predictive analytics and artificial intelligence to manage their data flows is pretty extraordinary. So we're very early in this journey. I hope Novartis can become a company that leads in that space. We've signed a few big collaborations to try to push us in that direction. A company called Science 37, which tries to do decentralized clinical trials through app-based technologies and visiting nurses. We signed another deal this quarter with a company called Pear Therapeutics, which takes cognitive behavioral therapy, turns it into an app, and tries to optimize how addiction therapy is provided. And those both that has an FDA label. So what I found is we're going to have to partner with the ecosystem to push our own thinking. We do a lot of work with Google Verily to try to fundamentally rethink how we run clinical trials. The big challenge for us is cultural. It's that we're used to doing things a certain way. I mean, we're a company of physicians and scientists. There's a way we've done things in drug discovery, drug development, and drug manufacturing for a century. Trying to get the culture to change that actually you can use this augmented intelligence to actually improve what you do is a mindset shift. So that's, I think, the real journey we're on. One of
the interesting things that I had a chance to read was Forbes talked a little bit about how you brought some of your people out to an air traffic control tower. Tell us about that and how that helps you on the cultural journey.
Well, the story actually starts in Disney World. So I was with my kids in Disney World, and I was struck by how they're able to make the flows of the whole park work through artificial intelligence. And actually, Disney World employs some of the biggest groups, interestingly, of folks from operations research in the world. I mean, they have a huge center where they're constantly optimizing flows. So I asked myself, wow, we run all of these clinical trials, and we largely do it based on human beings and Excel spreadsheets, and how could that make any sense? And so what we did is we went to Boeing, and we saw that Boeing, GE, and others are able to monitor all of their aircraft around the world in real time and basically see how those engines are performing. So there were then two directions that took us in. One, the idea of a study operations center so people can sit centrally. And right now, today, we can see how a trial site in South Africa at a given hospital is performing in terms of its quality metrics as of yesterday. And did the monitor go to monitor the site? And did the monitoring visit report get issued, for those of you who are in the world of clinical trials? The other direction it took us in is how can we just become part of the Internet of Things? How can we actually start to monitor patients to get data? That turned out to be much harder. I think, as many of you in the audience know, getting real validation that any of these monitoring tools can be used at the quality that FDA expects is quite challenging. But we've started in that journey. We did partnerships with Microsoft, partnerships with Google to find these sensors which could continuously monitor patients. One of the most exciting things we're working on is with MIT Media Lab. They do incredible work to figure out how can you passively monitor patient movement and use that potentially to assess quality of life endpoints in clinical trials. So that all came out of observing what happens in another industry, which is actually quite evolved. I mean, they're pretty advanced in how they think about this. So we're going to keep trying to learn from other industries because there's not enough learnings, frankly, in our industry to apply to one another.
Yeah, steal shamelessly. That's a great approach. One of the things you mentioned was the data that you have. Again, much of it maybe on Excel spreadsheets from clinical trials from the past, from years gone by, some of which led to a drug, some of which didn't. How are you trying to organize mining that and getting some value out of that information and using the tools that we're talking about here, artificial intelligence and machine learning, to make that happen?
I think our biggest learning has been how important it is to be able to integrate vast data sets in a way that then you can reasonably apply deep learning and artificial intelligence. I think the importance of clean data, integrated data, creating a data layer cannot be underestimated. In creating the Study Operations Center, it took us 18 months to integrate data across 11 different data systems to actually build the data bank, the data lake, if you want, to actually then apply the artificial intelligence. So we started with our operational data. Now we move to our clinical trial data. We have about 2 million patients in our databases of clinical trials that we've run in an electronic system, in an electronic data capture system over the last 20 years. And the question is, how do you bring all of that together? Well, the interesting insight is we were so focused on the endpoint, the FDA or the EMA endpoints, that we never collected the 80% of the data that we had. I mean, we never pulled that in from CROs, all the imaging data, the biomarker data, to then really mine it. So we have a big project now internally to bring all of that data together to actually build. We're working with partners to try to rapidly create data lakes for heart failure, for multiple sclerosis, for every one of our disease areas that then we can continuously mine. What is impressive is many of the startups I'm sure you've heard from in the conference are able to impute missing data fields and bring all of these data sets together. What we're learning is it's much harder than it looks, as always. The truth, of course, is trying to do this en masse is very challenging. But we believe if we can create that data lake, then we can find probably new drugs just in the data we already have. And that's the hope in doing this.
Can you say a little bit more about that last bit?
Yeah.
That notion of we're going to use this data and predict. Tell us about the predictive analytics and kind of the effort that you're putting behind that to really get those insights that are buried somewhere deep in that lake.
When you look at any clinical trial that we run, certainly, is you have such variability in patient response. In the end, because of our inability to discriminate between patient subgroups prospectively, we end up going with relatively broad exclusion criteria in most disease areas. Oncology may be an exception. And then we end up post hoc identifying high responding groups, but we can't really figure out why. My fundamental belief is that the human mind is always looking for binary relationships. We're trying to see, did this biomarker go up, and did that correlate with a better response? When it might actually be a signature across many different markers in ways that are non-intuitive. And so the idea here is if you go back to those data sets, and let's suppose, I'll take a real world example. If you take our upcoming launch of a migraine drug, what we see in those patients is we have 25 to 30% of patients who no longer have migraines after taking the medicine. And then we have a variable response in the other 75%. What if you could prospectively understand why did those 25% have a complete stop of their migraines? And so if you apply these technologies, I'm convinced that you can find these signatures which predict super responders. And if you could do that and then go to the FDA and say prospectively we're going to run the clinical trial on the super responders, I think it's better for patients. We actually get to higher efficacy medicines. It's better for the healthcare system because people pay for medicines that are really giving the big benefit. You avoid safety issues in patients that are not really responding. So there's a huge opportunity there. We have to get after it, and I think it will actually fundamentally change how we do drug discovery and development once we do it at scale.
That's terrific. One of the other things that came up in our conversation prior to this was the whole notion of leveraging telemedicine. All right? And so we think of telemedicine as a means to reach out to our patients and to connect with them, but you're thinking differently about how you're going to use that within a pharmaceutical company. What are the tools? How are you going to do that?
Yeah, I famously, and probably it will rue the day, I said at the Financial Times that we will find a way to take 20% of drug development costs out of
I think it said 25.
25,
just for the
right,
record.
Probably 25. But as part of that, we're now looking at a number of technologies to try to get down the cost of drug development. And one of them is a company I mentioned, Science 37. We partner with others as well. The idea here is you take a central group of physicians who end up being the investigators in the study. They work with the patient's home physician, but then we try to bring the clinical trial to the patient. And the idea here is, can you expand beyond tertiary care centers or the traditional clinical trial sites to find patients around the country, particularly in the US, much more complicated to do this in Europe. So if you take that case study, group of physicians in LA, they identified through digital and social networking patients who have a given disease. They enroll them in the study, visiting nurse goes to visit, and everything is done through an app called Nora. Nora has an integrated approach to do all of the elements of the clinical trial, and it's brought to the patient. So that actually brings down costs a lot because you don't need all of the infrastructure we often have. Now, the key is to make this work. The medical home has to still be maintained because you don't want to lose that connection with the primary care provider. But at least our initial work in this space has been pretty exciting, and we have 10 trials planned this year on the platform.
That's terrific. Just an audience question here, and this is definitely not in the softball area. The question was, which will guide the future of medicine? Biology of diseases or technologies based on our current experimental medicine approach? So this kind of taps into a lot of your background here.
So whenever I think about finding a drug, I always go back to take a big step back from a history standpoint. So if you go to the FDA records, there's only about 1,500 drugs that have ever been approved by the FDA in the last 100 years. So that tells you it is really hard to find even one drug that works. And then if you ask yourself why that's the case, in the end, we try to unpack 2 billion years of evolution in a cell in a matter of years. And that's a tall task. So I believe we have a lot of fundamental biological understanding still to capture. And without that real learning and understanding, I think the limits of artificial intelligence are what are the training data set you can give the machine. And if you don't have the real insights in the training data set, no matter what you do, the machine's not going to actually give you the insight of the new medicine. So what I believe, to the earlier comment, is we will still need to do the hard scientific work to find drug targets. And because it's just really hard. And if you look at the amount of the proteome that we actually have identified and really understood for its biology, it's really nothing. I mean, in each one of us, there's 30 billion chemical reactions that happen in the last minute, and we don't understand most of them. So there is a tremendous opportunity still in fundamental science. But once you find the target, how quickly you actually then can design the drug, I believe will get completely revolutionized. Because I think all of the understanding of monoclonal antibodies and how to optimize a monoclonal antibody, a number of companies have now published in Nature that they can optimize a chemical synthesis faster than a person if you really want to optimize a drug synthesis. So I think that's where the future will be headed.
One of the things that you talked about as well, though, is there's the notion of it can help us, come up with a great set of candidate molecules. But talk to us a little bit about the work that you're trying to do on identifying patients. You talked about those super responders, but it strikes me that there's also, when you're trying to get to that 25%, someone is coming up with the right molecules, but someone is finding the right patients to try them in. Tell us a little bit more about what Novartis is doing in that space.
Yeah, it's a tough challenge. I mean, a lot of it comes down to mining natural history data to really understand the underlying biology. Just yesterday, I was actually with a group of physicians here from Partners Health, and we were talking about preserved ejection fraction heart failure, which is surely a syndrome of many different types of heart failure, but we package it all together in preserved ejection fraction heart failure. Now the question is, how can we use analytics and machine learning to unpack that into individual patient groups? One of the things we're really trying to push with the regulators is how do we now, in therapeutic areas outside of oncology, how do we actually find these patient groups that can be very clearly defined? It's happening already. And if you look at asthma now, we use eosinophil counts to actually unpack the Th2 high asthma. You're going to surely see this, I think, as well in other disease states like heart failure. A lot of the work we're now doing is through, again, the deep mining of natural history data in patient populations. We're trying to build collaborations with centers around the world, and then to mine this data to say, can we identify a profile that would give us a chance to prospectively design a trial to find the super responder. It's not easy, but I think it's the future, because I think giving medicines to broad populations when there's so much patient heterogeneity is just not going to be the
That's not going to get you to 25%. No, that's true. Another audience question here is, will artificial intelligence have an impact on new clinical applications like gene therapy? And will Novartis hire data scientists or acquire startup as a strategy? So a bit of a split question there. So.
Yeah, I mean, first on gene therapy, I'm a big believer in the power of gene therapies, just because with monogenic diseases, the power of gene therapies to give transformational efficacy is striking. It's really striking. If they ultimately prove safe, the ability for these vectors to ultimately correct a single gene disorder, and the efficacy you see in ophthalmology, neuroscience, oncology is simply stunning. So that's for sure. I think we are hiring data scientists. I don't know if we hire data scientists necessarily for gene therapy. It's much more for the broader mining of all of our trial data and operational data. One of the challenges we have is attracting data scientists, because we're not as cool as Google or Facebook. I'm trying. You see the no tie.
We're not as cool.
I thought about genes.
Yeah.
I thought about genes.
We discussed earlier, like, when is it that you get in your career when you can lose the tie? It was February 1st. It's when you become the CEO.
Yeah, so now Novartis is no ties. We're not yet at the motorcycle jacket stage, but I'm working on it.
Sorry to disappoint.
But really what we have to appeal to people is a big sense of purpose, right? If you're a company that's fundamentally focused on finding medicines that transform patient care and help physicians transform the lives of patients around the world, if you're a data scientist, would you want to participate in that? Even if we're relatively early in the maturity scale. But that's a big challenge for us, absolutely.
As you think about Novartis as this data science company in the future, what do you, when you look down the horizon, what do you see as the big barriers that you talked a little bit earlier about regulation, but you just barely touched on it. But dig a little bit deeper in that and help us understand what are the things that you see as the obstacles in your way of making that vision a reality.
I can give some concrete examples. So if you think about a company like Pear Therapeutics has built an algorithm, machine learning, behind which it's able to optimize cognitive behavioral therapy for addiction disorders, and they have an FDA label. Now, what if they want to update the algorithm? And they're going to want to constantly update the algorithm. How does the FDA regulate the algorithm update? Do you have to file a new SNDA every single time you do an update? These are things that nobody knows. And similarly, when we've gone into the world of, I mentioned the decentralized trials, nobody has filed a decentralized trial yet. So we don't know what the regulator is going to say. I believe this FDA is extremely open to these technologies. They've shown it as well with real world evidence. But in the end, the proof is going to be when the filing comes and what do we learn from that interaction. So I think there's the whole world of regulation that we'll have to improve. I think the second is data privacy. I mean, I don't know how much it's been talked about here, but certainly with the situations that we've had in the newspapers here in the United States
and in
Europe, the privacy data regulation will come into force now. How will we as a company be able to mine data, and what are the consents that we need is an area that's ambiguous right now. Part of our challenge is we want to mine our historical clinical data is in some countries it's ambiguous. If you didn't explicitly ask in the consent, are you able to mine even anonymized data? So these are, I think, a very important question. And then the third is the own transformation of our own company and people. I talked about the cultural element. In this whole world of data and digital, you have to be much more comfortable with rapid cycle innovation and rapid failure. We're a company that's used to using 10 years to find one drug and doing 3-year clinical trials, right, to figure this out. So now you have to
sound like 25% efficiency. Yeah.
And so we need to really rethink our whole way of approaching our work. And that's a big push for me right now, is a cultural transformation.
Time for another audience question. The question is, isn't there a natural tension between delivering drugs to the broadest population as a pharma company versus the precision approach to targeting smaller groups, to getting to those super responders? How do you think about that tension when you're thinking about your whole portfolio?
It's an interesting question. In the same 2-week period, we announced the proposed acquisition of a gene therapy company and also announced a multi-year commitment to develop new medicines for malaria. And so what I always think about is you need leaders who can hold seemingly contrary positions in their mind and find a way to balance them. People always ask me, as a business leader, are you about the short term or the long term? And it's both, you know? And similarly, I think as one of the largest healthcare companies in the world, we have to be able to balance bringing medicines like heart failure medicines to millions of patients and malaria medicines to tens of millions of patients, along with bringing forward gene therapies and cell therapies that are highly precise and deliver a significant therapeutic benefit. The onus is on us over time. If you go back in the late 1980s, monoclonal antibodies were thought to be extremely expensive, extremely complicated, and wouldn't reach most people. Now we live in a world where biosimilar monoclonal antibodies are being rolled out in Africa. I have no doubt that if you take a 20, 30-year view, I mean, we will figure out how to make cell therapies a lot more cheaply and efficiently, and figure out a way that it doesn't require complex manufacturing. The same goes with gene therapies, but it's just going to take time. Our role as a company has to be to innovate at that high end and then keep working to expand access over time.
That's true. You know, we just have a few minutes left, and I just want to give you a chance to tell us what's got you most excited when you think about the transformation to a pharmaceutical and data science company, and what you're hearing about, hearing about artificial intelligence, machine learning, liberating all this data. What's got you excited? What's some great things that you say, boy, this is where I'm really looking forward to taking Novartis to?
Yeah, so some of it is mundane things, but in my world, it matters so much. I just think we can become so much more efficient as a company in bringing medicines forward, which will then allow us to create a better value proposition to society and really move to value-based pricing and make our medicines more affordable. That is a big task for me, but if you can think about 120,000 people and the 68 production sites and 500 clinical trials, the power to just make us much more efficient is a burning platform. Second, I think we will find completely new patient populations and super responders and be able to transform patient care. And I think that's exciting. It's going to be a long road. It won't be fast. But I think if we can be a leader in that space, given the amount of data we have, I think we can bring real transformative innovation forward. The other two things, though, that have got me really excited, don't necessarily relate to data and digital, is how can I transform a pharmaceutical company that's stayed in the old industrial world into a completely different company that's much more fit for the future from a cultural standpoint, that's much more focused on its people and how we can get really smart people to bring the best ideas forward. And then very passionate about the opportunity to reframe our industry's role in society. I wrote an editorial today in the Wall Street Journal on malaria. It's very unusual for a pharma CEO's first editorial in the Wall Street Journal to be about malaria. But I spent time, during my time at HMS in Africa, a lot of time in Africa. I grew up under the auspices of Paul Farmer and Jim Kim at Partners in Health. And I believe deeply in our social purpose. And I'm very excited about taking a long journey to try to reframe how this industry is viewed, how Novartis is viewed first, and hopefully that we can become not just a respected pharmaceutical company, but regain the trust of society to be one of the most respected companies in any industry. I know we have a lot to fix and a lot to improve on, but that's got me very excited.
That's an incredibly high bar, and that is a great place to end this conversation. So Vas, welcome back to Boston. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.